Diane comes back up. I just want to remind everyone, or if I didn't tell you before, on your agenda there's a box at the bottom and there is a link. And if you go to that link, you will find, these PowerPoints and slides, plus, numerous other helpful links to like different cities' climate action plans and resources, all the handouts in your folder. So I just wanted to let you guys know about that.
What is it now? So now we'll get into a little bit of the nit-grit about what is a climate action plan. How many of you are members of the Tea Party? Okay, well, if you were, you would say that ICLEI is a United Nations plot to force us all to move into cities, give up our cars, and only ride public transit. Now, if you're not a member of the Tea Party, you would probably recognize ICLEI as the international commission that is really working to reduce global climate change. So they've laid out this 5-step process that we go through in figuring out how locally we can reduce our greenhouse gases. And as Nicole said, it starts at the top with leadership commitment. If we're talking about our local cities, that's a majority vote of the elected members of your city council. That's what it takes to make it happen. But in addition to that, you've got to have key staff inside, because having the policy direction doesn't make it happen unless you've got key staff within the city who are really committed to carry that plan out. You start with an inventory, current emissions, setting your targets, developing the cap, implementing it, and then the critical piece is monitoring the results. And that sets up the entire circle. We monitor the results over time. Did we reduce those greenhouse gases or not? If not, we got to do more corrective action, fine-tune the plan, and it's a circle. The bottom line objective is to reduce those greenhouse gases to that target level. And if we look at one city of San Marcos, cap process overview. We can go back one. So the local inventory is really the key. That's the starting point in terms of the numbers. And you'll see them talk about projecting BAU emissions level. BAU, business as usual. That's what happens if we really do nothing. If we continue to grow, if we continue to add more people to the region, more jobs to the region, drive our cars the way we are, that's what will happen. But what we want to do is to change that trajectory and actually reduce greenhouse gases. And the key thing in terms of the climate action plans is addressing what's called the gap, the difference between where we project we're going to be and where we need to be to reach that target. So if we look at the city of San Marcos, we graph what that looks like. So I'm going to point over here. You see where we are? We're in 2005 to start. Business as usual is the blue line. We do nothing, we just keep going straight up. The target is set for 2020, that's the turquoise line, and 2030. Between the blue and the brown is what is projected with some of the actions that are already being done by the state level. The gap is the 148,694 metric tons per year. So that gap is what the local climate action plan is designed to address. Very specific, quantified numbers. So the actions to address it need to also be very specific, quantifiable, and show if we do these things, how are we actually going to reduce that gap? And so each step in that whole process, there are a whole lot of issues that we need to pay attention to as we go through it. Starting with the inventory. What's excluded? What's included in that inventory? Carlsbad, we got a big power plant right on the coast of Carlsbad. Is that, the emissions from that plant, are they included in that inventory? What do you think?
No.
They're not. They're part of the state inventory. Remember the state of California, that was the second biggest cause. So all of those emissions, they get counted at the state. They're not counted locally. How about airports? We got an airport in Carlsbad, we got one in Oceanside. Are they counted? Well, I'll tell you, the Carlsbad one isn't because that's part of county land, so they count it. The Oceanside one is. So you gotta kind of check the details of what really is part of our baseline emissions inventory. One of the key things is, when was that inventory done? There's a big change that occurred in how we account for vehicles mile travel, VMT. And because transportation is the biggest sector, that's the biggest cause of greenhouse gas emissions. How we count VMT is really critical. For the CATs that were done more than a year and a half or so ago, they used the old method of doing it. And all this data is developed by SANDAGs, our Regional Transportation Planning Agency. So they got a huge... I think we can put that right back on here. I'll try not to do that again. So they have a huge database of travel behavior across the whole region. So what they used to do is they called it a clipped VMT computation. So if a car is traveling through the region and it hits the boundaries of your city, the miles within your city gets counted, and when it hits the boundary going out the other side, they're not counted. Of course, there was no way to figure that out. That was just based on computer models. The new system of doing it says if a trip starts in our city and ends in our city, 100% of the miles get counted. If a trip starts outside our city and ends in our city, 50%. 50% goes to one city, 50% to the other. Those pass-through trips, they get charged to SANDAG. So over time, we're going to start to see that number in the local jurisdictions, as they revise their VMT, will go down because they'll be shifting some responsibility to SANDAG. So do we trust SANDAG to do what they should do for the regional?
No.
So it means that we've got to really pay attention to both ends of this. We've got to care about what's happening within our cities as well as that regional planning agency. And setting a target. There's a lot of issues to look at in setting that target. So there's a very specific requirement for reducing the greenhouse gases by 2020, but then what happens after that? We want to see that trajectory keep going down over time. Some of the cities got a future target 2030, some go to 2035. A lot of them do nothing after 2020, like magically, I guess things will continue to get better. So that's a key issue to look at. How are those targets, and are we really doing long range? What's going to happen over time? What's really controllable? We look at our local government really has great control over municipal operations. How are they handling water? How are they handling sewer, water treatment? They've got a lot of control over those things as city government. How much control do they have over things in the broader community? That's a little tougher call, and how they do that is a little bit more of a challenge. But and I guess the bottom line I say is kind of common sense. A lot of this number crunching all comes from huge computer models. But I look at the case of the city of Vista. One of the action measures in their climate action plan is to increase the percentage of bicycle trips by 1%. Now that sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? But currently bicycle trips are 1% of the total trips in the community. And by increasing it 1%, they're really saying we're going from 1% to 2%. We're doubling the amount of people who ride a bicycle, get out of their car and ride a bicycle for a trip. By 2020, we're doubling that number. We adopted a new bicycle plan in Vista, was just adopted a couple months ago. How many dollars did they allocate to implement that plan? 0. So with putting 0 money into bicycle improvements, their plan still assumes twice as many people will be riding bicycle in the next 5 years. Of course, that's not common sense that'll happen like that. So those are things that we need to be looking at. If we look at our local community breakdown of emissions by sector, this is a draft inventory by the City of Oceanside. It's pretty typical, but it's really important to get a handle on that inventory for your own city. Again, local city, transportation is the biggest chunk of it. Residential, energy use, and commercial industrial are the next two. So as Nicole was saying, their objective is to reduce, to get 100% clean energy by 2035. That blue and yellow triangle will be zero. They will be completely gone if we achieve 100% clean energy. So that's a huge impact. And it's real important that knowing that picture, what we select in terms of action items. But looking at the City of Vista Climate Action Plan has got a great little measure to do community tree planting. That's something that a lot of people embrace that idea. It has a lot of benefits. Doing that tree planting, we will save 126 metric tons of greenhouse gases. Their plan also has smart growth. Smart growth, if done right, will reduce 4,962 metric tons. Where do we want to put our energy, really, if we're trying to reduce greenhouse gases? We got to pay attention to smart growth, because that's where we have the impact. So we start looking at some of the details in those sectors, because each city has got a little bit different picture. I think I talked before about VMT. There's a lot of ways we can reduce the number of miles we drive in a car. We can emphasize alternative transportation, the biking, the walking, I commute, all of those kinds of things. Smart growth, we live closer to where we work. We don't have as long a trip. That reduces the VMT. So there are a whole range of ways we can do it. Which ones we select, it really comes down to political choice within the local community. So that's where we can really have a big impact. What are the things that people care about most? Let's tie it back to community values. Pick the things that give us the biggest bang for the buck, but also that connects with what we care about in our community. And then, guys, I don't know what that last bullet point was even meant to say in there. I'm going to just skip that. Who wrote this? Residential energy use. And that's the next one. The second highest in most cities, our residential energy use is the second highest cause of emissions. Again, there's a lot of things that can be done to reduce our residential energy use. Achieving LED standards. There's been lots of rebate programs from the state level, from energy efficiency to rooftop solar. But what does this local city really do about that? The local city can take a real minimal action, like saying, we're going to do expedited permit processing. If you want to put rooftop solar, instead of taking 6 months to process a permit, we'll let you get it through in 2 or 3 months. How much of a difference do you think that's really going to make? Or they require all new building to be solar ready, or they take the next step, like some places in California have done that. Every building permitted in the city is going to actually have rooftop solar installed by the time it's occupied. So we have a whole and a community choice energy for a move on that. We'll talk about that more a little bit later, but community choice energy is a real big one to impact that residential. Back one. What doesn't reduce greenhouse gases? Well, I think one of our big concerns with the City of Carlsbad Climate Action Plan, one more, is 2020, there's no actions. Their climate action plan, somehow magically we're going to reduce greenhouse gases by policy in our general plan. We're trying to figure out how a policy in a plan that sits on the shelf actually reduces greenhouse gases. Now, if you take a whole lot of leaps of faith that, oh, well, the policy then says we're going to do implementing ordinances and then things that will be done differently, and so therefore, that is a pretty big leap of faith. We got to have measurable, enforceable. We're going to deal with that gap. We got to have something we can count and measure that will really make a difference. Community education outreach is a real key part of this whole thing. How we really let people in the community know and understand and get engaged in these things. Again, that doesn't we can't quantify that, but it certainly ties to every one of the measures we're trying to achieve, and it needs to be an important part of every one of these plans. And I'm just going to end with what are the 2 most important things a local climate action plan can include to reduce greenhouse gases. And this is based on some of the work that EPIC has done. They've been the primary number crunchers. have evaluated the data for most of the cities in San Diego County. Two things they say that will make the biggest difference: community choice energy and smart growth. We get our biggest bang for the buck, and look at those two things. What investment does it take of our local tax dollars to achieve that? Almost none. We get the biggest reduction in greenhouse gases at the lowest public cost. That's a win-win for everybody. For everybody except SDG&E.